When I was an undergraduate at UCLA, I had two great loves. One was the Middle East, and I was studying Arabic, and I was studying Islamic culture, and I was studying language and history. And the other great love was the Soviet Union. And I was reading the memoirs of dissidents. I later found out that most of those memoirs were published by Bob Bernstein when he was at Random House. But on the one hand, I was reading about Natan Sharansky and Andrei Sakharov and Anatoly Marchenko and Andrei Amalrik and Vladimir Bukovsky and many, many others. And they helped set my worldview, and they helped imbue me with a love of liberty and a sense of the importance of one man's struggle against totalitarianism. And at the same time, I was reading blogs of young Egyptians and Syrians that blew my mind. The clarity, the foresight, the poise, the prose. And it struck me that there was a great connection between the two, the same ideas that were epitomized in the Soviet dissidents, a sense that one's freedom exists inside him and not outside of him, a sense that he is more free even than his interrogators. I remember reading in Andrei Amalrik's memoirs, Notes of a Revolutionary, that he said, "My freedom exists inside me and I am more free even than my KGB interrogators." And at the same time, I was reading the blog of Karim Amr, a young Egyptian who subsequently spent the last 4 years in Egyptian prison. And he wrote the exact same thing. Two people who had no connection, who were decades apart, who never met each other, with totally different life experiences. But the experience of prison and the experience of tyranny was the same. I then spent some time in the Islamist slums of Cairo, and it was there that I saw firsthand the utter dysfunction, the despair, the dilapidation, the misery, the alienation, the isolation of Egypt. And I saw with my own eyes how decrepit this regime was. And when I left there in 2006, my thoughts were, this is a country that is crumbling. This is a country which cannot sustain itself, a lesson I took from the Soviet dissidents that I had come to love, a sense that autocracy is never stable, that it's rotten from the inside, that it is deeply insecure and fearful, and it's for that reason that it needs to place people who voice dissent in prison. It's for that reason that it needs to exile people merely with other opinions. And so I was sitting there and I was thinking, what is it that I can do to help these people who symbolize all that we should value? Freedom, democracy, individual rights. And it struck me that the most effective way, at least the Soviet dissidents felt this way, was that desperate struggle to get their samizdat, their underground literature, known in the West, for Western journalists and Western policymakers and Western activists to understand their struggle and to come to their aid. I remember reading a quote from Sharansky, and I'd like to share it with you now. He wrote, "In 1986, the Soviet dissident Anatoly Marchenko died in the famous Chistopol prison after a long and futile hunger strike for improved conditions. 3 years earlier, I had gone on a similar hunger strike in the same prison and had been subjected to the same torturous conditions by KGB thugs. But the authorities eventually gave in to my demands. Why? Because my 9 years of imprisonment were accompanied by a relentless worldwide campaign of steady, unambiguous pressure on the communist regime by leaders of the free world. The regime knew that it would pay a heavy price if I were to die. With Marchenko, it was confident that the world did not care enough to do much more than mount a formal protest." Now this I find is persuasive, at least from the side of the dissidents. But how do we know that actually impacted the policymakers of the evil empire? An empire which spanned 11 time zones, which killed tens of millions of people, which had tens of thousands of nuclear warheads aimed at the West. How do we know that the voice of these dissidents actually impacted them? The answer to that comes to me by way of one of our board members and someone who's been deeply involved in both UN Watch and Freedom Now, and that's Irwin Cotler, the former Justice Minister of Canada. And Irwin told me the following thing. In 1997, he was honored at a dinner with Gorbachev. And he approached Gorbachev and he said, "I was Natan Sharansky's lawyer, and I would like to know, there's been a question that's been vexing me for years. Why did you let Sharansky out of prison?" And this is his verbatim response. Gorbachev said the following: "I never knew anything about Sharansky. I never even knew the name. I came to Canada as the Minister of Agriculture, and I appeared before a Canadian Parliamentary Committee on agriculture. But instead of getting questions about agriculture, I got questions about Sharansky. I left the Parliament building and saw placards of Sharansky. Wherever I went, I was confronted by Sharansky. So I came back to the Soviet Union and I said, who is this guy, Sharansky? I got the files and said, well, he may have been a troublemaker, but he isn't a criminal. So we ordered his release. Yelena Bonner, Andrei Sakharov's wife and one of our founding board members until her recent passing, said the only real defense for us and for everyone fighting for human rights is publicity. Valery Chalidze, who formed the first human rights NGO in the Soviet Union together with Sakharov, said the following: I propose that the most important contribution that can be made to the defense of human rights in any country is publicity, making sure that violations of rights and appeals in defense of rights become known to a wide audience. He writes, suffering is even more intolerable when a victim knows that he is forgotten, that nobody in the world cares about his pain and destruction. Now, when the great Ahmed Batabi, who is in the back, first went to prison, the judge showed him a picture of the cover of The Economist with the famous picture of the white bloodied shirt and hands raised. And he said, with this picture, you have signed your own death warrant. But Ahmed has later said that that picture actually helped save his life because there were dissidents to his left and right who we've never heard of, who you've never heard of, who Western policymakers never heard of, that have disappeared without a trace. And so I decided, together with Sharansky, we approached him with the idea of creating an organization that would support those on the front lines against tyranny today. Those using the internet, those using blogs and Twitter and Facebook, who I recognized a few years ago had even greater liberties than in traditional media. They had the same desperation to get their voice heard in the West, and they faced the same frustrations of Western policymakers and press and activists not hearing their story. And so the more we formed this organization, the more we thought about it, I was concerned about the strategic challenges that face cyber-dissidents today. Namely, how is it that with this deluge of information, with hundreds of millions of Facebook users, how do you get your message out? When I spoke at Google, I was in a room with 15 of the top cyber-dissidents from the Arab world, people who now have become much more famous than they once were. And I said, you guys have a problem, because today you have unprecedented power. With the click of a button, you can reach literally millions of people. And yet not one person in a million knows your name. They don't know your face. And if they don't know your name and face, they don't care about your struggle. There's nothing that speaks more loudly and more profoundly than that individual face and that individual name. And that's not conjecture, that's proven. There's a fascinating study done by a University of Oregon psychology professor, where he had 3 test groups, and he laid in front of these test groups 3 different sets of information. The first group got facts about the millions of people starving in Africa. The second group got the picture of a single 7-year-old child who was starving in Africa. And the third group got both a boy and a girl who were both 7 years old. And each group was allotted a particular sum of money. And he asked them, how much of this money are you willing to give? And the first group that got facts about the millions of people starving gave on average half as much as those confronted with the single face and the single name. And so I set about to tell the stories of these brave individuals who went to prison for exceedingly long periods of time for no crime whatsoever. People whom were long forgotten even by the great American Republic. And when I thought about cases like Egypt and young Karim Amr, who was 22 years old when he first went to prison, I realized that Egypt is a country that has gotten over $50 billion worth of US aid. And I wondered, how is it possible? How is it possible that his name is not raised in every bilateral meeting with Egyptian diplomats? How can we let them get away with this? When I looked at Saudi Arabia, I saw Hadi al-Mutif in prison for 17, 18 years for making a joke about religion. And then I saw $60 billion worth of arms being sent to Saudi Arabia. And I asked myself, how is it that this name is not known, that this face is not known, that more isn't being done to help them? And so some of the activities we do at Cyber-Dissidents, and now under the umbrella organization of Advancing Human Rights, is an attempt to highlight their individual voices. So we hold conference calls between senators and bloggers. And amazing things have happened on these conference calls. In one, we connected Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois with the brother of a currently imprisoned Egyptian blogger. And on that call, Senator Kirk said to him, "How can I help your brother?" And he said, "Please write a letter to General Tantawi, head of the military, and appeal for my brother's release." On that very same day, a letter was drafted between Mark Kirk and Frank Wolf and sent to General Tantawi and sent to our Secretary of State and sent to the Egyptian ambassador. Here was one of the most powerful people in the United States speaking to someone whom we've never heard of. And yet that sense of empowerment, that sense of solidarity, I think is irreplaceable to them. When we connect bloggers with student leaders in America, we hear constantly, if we are not connected to these people, if we don't hear their voices, if they don't know about our struggle, we feel alone. Sharansky said that his happiest day in 9 years of imprisonment was when the United States called the Soviet Union an evil empire and spoke with the clarity and foresight that this regime would collapse, that we needed to be on the right side of history, and that we couldn't appease this regime which sent so many tens of millions to the Gulag. Another way that we approach this issue is with a little bit of irreverence. The issue of Saudi Arabia I find particularly vexing, one of the most draconian dictatorships on earth, and yet the names of these dissidents are rarely known, and the struggle for women's rights is not prominent in our collective discourse. And so we created the first ever Saudi Women's Grand Prix, a car race just for Saudi women, because Saudi women are forbidden from driving. And Andrea Malrik said that his way of dealing with the KGB interrogators was with humor and irreverence. He used to make fun of his KGB interrogators. So I thought, what better way than to have famous female race car drivers sign a petition, which they did, together with US policymakers, a former national security advisor, a former head of CIA, the first woman to race in the Daytona 500. Amazing people coming together with the message that this struggle our freedom is intimately tied to their freedom. Our safety is tied to their freedom. As Václav Havel said, there can be no international peace and security without domestic peace and security. I remember I was in Istanbul and I ran across someone who was a member of the first trade delegation to Turkey. The first trade delegation to Libya, when Libya was good, before Muammar Gaddafi again started slaughtering people. And I asked his opinion of Fatih al-Jahmi, the most famous Libyan dissident who had died a short time earlier. And he looked at me and he said, "Who?" A member of the very first trade delegation to Muammar Gaddafi did not know the name of the single most prominent Libyan dissident. And I compare this to the era of the 1980s, when I heard from the chief negotiator with the Soviets of bilateral arms treaties that in every single meeting with the Soviets, they said, the reason we can't trust you on bilateral arms negotiations is because you are in violation of the Helsinki Final Act. And the way that you treat Sharansky, Sakharov, and Orlov means that we cannot trust you on matters of international peace and security. This is the kind of idea that I want to revive. I want to revive the idea of linkage. The freedom of these internet activists to speak their mind without going to prison should be tied to foreign aid. It should be tied to arms sales. I envision a time when $60 billion worth of aid are tied directly to the rights of women to drive in Saudi Arabia. And for every $1 billion they get of arms, they have to let one woman drive in my Grand Prix. Thanks so much.